There was an idea. Stark knows this. Called the Avengers Initiative. The idea was to bring together a group of remarkable people. See if they could become something more. See if they could work together when we needed them to fight the battles that we never could.
Hello everyone, I'm That Other George, and I recently rewatched all 4 Avengers movies in preparation for this video. I also chucked Captain America Civil War into the mix, since, you know, it's technically halfway there. I all around have a very positive outlook on this collection of films and the MCU as a whole. Sure, the cinematic universe does contain some pretty bad and very mediocre movies in there, but if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, there is a lot to appreciate in terms of what this series achieves. And Endgame is basically the film that sums up the whole Infinity Saga, particularly with the character growth we see take place across all of these movies. Obviously Tony Stark once stood out as quite an egotistical character, caring a lot more about himself rather than the people around him. But over the course of these movies, this attitude just slowly fades away, to the point where at the end of Infinity War he feels tremendous guilt for his actions. Despite it not directly being his fault, it does impact him a lot when he loses someone very close to him that he felt responsible for. And that gives him the striving motivation to make things right, because deep down that's what he's always wanted to do. We then have Captain America, a noble hero and leader who's always been there for other people, always pointing them in the right direction. And goddamn is this extremely prevalent in Endgame. We then have Thor, son of Odin, who to me at one stage was one of the least interesting characters, but now is like one of my favourites thanks to Taika Waititi and the Russo brothers, because they've really fixed his character across these 3 movies. Thor's had this fantastic arc of aiming to be this glorious king, but in actuality finds himself as much more of an individual lone wolf, wanting to always be out on different quests. He does look out for his people, but he's had so many of these tragic events occur to him, and this has seemingly pushed him to find out who he truly is. The dude. I guess there's Hulk. I like him a lot. I think he's had some really great moments in the MCU, particularly in the first Avengers where he's constantly smashing everything. And I also enjoyed him a lot in Ragnarok, with the chemistry he had either beating up or teaming up with Thor. But there's also been a couple weird moments where you sort of question why his character's being taken in that direction, but you know, pretty exceptional cast all round. These characters being so layered and having all of these vastly different personalities is what causes all of these lows to happen. But when the time comes, they put all their differences aside to team up and do the right thing. And having the personality and hearts behind all the action is really what makes these set of films, along with so many other films in the MCU, very special. So, how well does Endgame fit into all of this? I would say exceedingly well, but that's not to say there aren't a few major flaws with it. But firstly, let's start with the positives. Of course, after the horrific events of Infinity War with half of all life being wiped out, the other half of the characters are in quite a bit of distraught. The performances from all cast members delivers this idea perfectly. The colouring is extremely dull and shallow to emphasise sadness, which goes so well when the characters are either slowly finding out about the event or trying their best to cope with it. Time travel, I'll get into, don't worry. But what I loved about it was how it pays tribute to every single film that came before it. This may seem like quite a weird compliment, but I found it quite impressive that this film manages to capture all of those movies really well. This is where you can tell that the Russo brothers care about this series. When they went back to 2012, it looked and played out exactly like Joss Whedon's movie. I just find that a lot of sequels nowadays that reference the past movies often just don't fully understand the thing they are referencing. And I still don't understand how these guys managed to direct so many characters. The structure of it all is mind-blowing. Every character gets their moment and it's brilliant to see. I could go on and on about every technical detail, but that's basically the core of what I love about Endgame. Alright, on to the negatives. Hear me out here. I do not like how Captain Marvel fits into this universe. Her character is just obnoxious and not in a funny Rocket Raccoon kind of way.
If we do this, how do we know it's gonna end any differently than it did before?
Because before you didn't have me.
You know how a minute ago I was going over how each individual Avenger is so special? You can only describe her character as invincible, and that's not a good thing. It's so satisfying seeing fictional characters who are complete nobodies have to work their way up the ladder and prove themselves to be worthy of the hero title. The MCU film that describes this best is the Guardians of the Galaxy. They belong in prison. That's how bad they've been in past times. But with the characters having such down points, such individual motivation, but then come together as a team to fight a huge threat that's leagues above anything they've ever encountered before, makes the ending of that film very rewarding not only for our heroes, but ultimately for us. But nope, Captain Marvel, she just rolls out of bed in the morning and falls straight through a gigantic ship, sawing it in half. Nice. Well, at least we didn't have to put up with her for the whole film. She was the only superhero I had any major issues with, unlike the plot, which unfortunately has quite a few problems, mainly with the time travel stuff. There's still debates happening to this day questioning whether or not the film sticks to its rules on time travel or not, but all that aside, my main issue with it is how on the nose it all feels. To me, it very much came across as, oh, I guess we need time travel to solve this problem. Well, Tony's smart, he can invent it. It kind of happened out of nowhere, and the biggest compliment I've had for the past Marvel films is the gradual build-up of events. You can take pretty much any example for this, but the one that comes to mind for me is the connection between the first Avengers and Homecoming. The Avengers very clearly establishes the idea that the Chitauri have very advanced technology that deals with a fair amount of damage. The Homecoming villain Vulture has a clear motivation for wanting to work with this technology to make money from it. The context from the Avengers supports this idea tremendously, and means that there doesn't have to be any pointless exposition to explain why the technology is of such good use. Even once the concept of time travel is actually invented, it's still a bit too overt. Hulk basically just turns around to the camera and explains the concept to you, and the characters around him just act like confused audience members.
Becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future.
Exactly.
So Back to the Future is a bunch of bullshit?
It's quite the breaking of the fourth wall. And to be fair, it is kind of funny, but I just don't think it's great from a creative writing standpoint. So yeah, there is a bit of criticism there. But like with any video in this series, the genuine valid criticism is never the issue at hand, because some people are just too unreasonable. Yep folks, it's that part of the show. So, Martin Scorsese. Now I mentioned that name and half of you are probably excited that I'm about to tear into him, and the other half of you are most likely on the edge of your seat, trembling in fear. Well, sorry to disappoint, but I don't really care about what Scorsese said. I find the reaction from both sides to be far more ridiculous. So let's just take a look at his quote. Marvel movies are not cinema. DC movies are not cinema. Cinema is when robots from the planet Cybertron land on Earth, and they transform into cars, and then Decepticons come, and they transform into cars too, and then they fight, and also Shia LaBeouf is there. I have a sneaking suspicion that might be the wrong quote. I don't see them, I tried, you know, but that's not cinema. Honestly, the closest I can think of them, as well made as they are, with actors doing the best they can under the circumstances, is theme parks. It isn't the cinema of human beings trying to convey emotion, psychological experiences to another human being. Now I can definitely see where he's coming from with this. In fact, I think a lot of people would argue that Marvel movies are very well made. They just get really tired of the sheer amount of them that get released, which whilst I don't personally agree, I can totally get behind it. To me, the Marvel movies are just fun flicks. Majority of them don't take themselves too seriously, and that's what I enjoy them for. There's no way I'd put them on the same playing field as other superhero movies like Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, Nolan's Dark Knight, James Gunn's Super, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, The Incredibles, or Logan. And that's okay, because I find that everything has its place in cinema. You are always going to get the Fast and Furious movies, but you'll always get those rare, brilliant gems from time to time. As for the comment itself, I can totally get the comparison to theme park rides if he's talking about something like Age of Ultron, a film that is very void of taking any risks, so it just sort of comes across as a very mediocre superhero movie. But the MCU has really proven itself in recent times, and I feel like if you were to read this quote whilst watching the end of Guardians 2, it would be quite difficult to agree with. And to those who will counter with, "That's just like his opinion, man," I understand that for the most part, but saying these films aren't cinema is just a little bit more fundamental than just explaining a personal preference. So in the same way that Scorsese has allowed his opinion on MCU films, I think people should be allowed to have their opinions on his opinion. But this is the internet we're talking about. And the quote is basically going to serve as confirmation bias to each opposing side. The people that go to Comic-Con dressed as Captain Marvel are most likely going to hate Martin Scorsese forever and hope they get the opportunity to electrocute him. And then the sort of artsy-fartsy douchebags are just going to take this as definitive proof for why Marvel films are objectively bad, because the thought of an explosion taking place on screen makes them want to puke. So yeah, all in all, Martin Scorsese, keep making excellent films. Taxi Driver is in like my top 20 films of all time. It's so brilliant. And to the people still arguing over this,
Why so serious?
okay, so as we approach the climax of this video, I feel like it is very appropriate to respond to a video by The Closer Look, discussing why Endgame's climax is a waste of potential. Now, as with most people I seem to respond to, I'm actually a huge fan of his channel. He makes very vague video essays on his channel, but I feel like they can offer a very good insight into writing behind films. But this video kind of sucks. I'm sorry. I even commented on it saying, "I've rewatched Endgame a couple times now and I still can't get over how brilliant the climax is." And he responds with, "Sure, it may be brilliant, but just because something is good does not mean it is devoid of flaws and couldn't have been a lot better." I know, I didn't say otherwise. I was more speaking from an emotional point of view as someone who likes the MCU. Now, after rewatching Endgame for the third time and the Close Looks video, I would actually go a step further than just saying it's just an emotional connection, and I'd argue it is a pretty damn solid climax. So let's just dive into the video. He actually starts off the video by listing off a couple compliments, but then takes a little bit of a turn from there.
The end of Avengers Endgame was outstanding. Iron Man sacrificed, Captain America going back in time, the portal scene, the fight with the big three duked out with Thanos, all of that was just a fantastic spectacle. And after this outstandingly well executed build-up, we see everyone run up at each other, and I was left profoundly disappointed.
He then goes on to make this point about how Endgame can only be looked at as a spectacle if you remove the context from it.
Because the reason why this scene is good is because of all the work that's come before it. And if you strip away all of the context, so you are just left with this battle scene in itself, this scene doesn't do anything new.
It's a very weird way of framing a criticism like this. It's just very strange considering that a finale is meant to be a conclusion. Typically this point gets made in the opposite way. My go-to for this is that I don't really like Batman vs Superman, but the warehouse scene is very well shot, choreographed, and has some great action, so I can appreciate it as its own thing. I can just watch that clip on YouTube and not really care about the context behind it. Then there's something like Civil War, which has a really great fight scene, but spends the whole film building up to it through characters simply disagreeing with each other. But show this fight scene to someone who's never seen the film before, and they're probably going to be quite confused as to why superheroes are fighting each other. So yeah, like, the context is pretty important at just building up to that final story. He then goes on to compare Endgame's climax to other battles.
The Battle of the Bastards, the opening of Saving Private Ryan, the battle for Minas Tirith, the end of Avengers Endgame doesn't even hold a candle.
Some very weird choices, but I guess the only other superhero battles he would be able to compare to would be something like Justice League, which just wouldn't support his argument too much. Closer Look then makes the point that battles shouldn't be just pure spectacle.
Making a great fight scene is just like any scene in your story. It is like telling a story in miniature. You can't do what a child does with his toys. You can't just grab all of your characters, throw them into a field together with no clear rhyme or reason as they duke it out, then all of a sudden one side wins the battle in a single move.
It's a difficult one because he sort of wants it both ways, where the fight scene shouldn't just be pure spectacle, but it also can't rely on prior context. His point being that there needs to be a story and progression in the actual battle itself as well as the film as a whole, which I think is just really selling it short, considering that there's a lot of great character team-ups, struggles with the Infinity Gauntlet, and the everlasting consequence when Tony realises how he can save everyone. But all that aside, in all honesty, I think he's very biased towards Lord of the Rings. Despite the fact that I absolutely love the Lord of the Rings series, I do find it a tad bit unfair to compare to a superhero film. A surprising amount of the runtime of this video is just talking about why various Lord of the Rings battles work so well, which they do, I can't agree with him more there. But it's so jarring whenever he transitions back to talking about Endgame.
The Siege of Helm's Deep is such a compelling battle scene, and why Endgame is less so is that very ingredient that I just mentioned. The ingredient of progression.
He's just so hung up on this idea of progression, but as we've established, there's quite a bit of it in Endgame.
The dynamic of the fight in the first 2.5 minutes never shifts to any one side's favour. I mean, the battle doesn't even have a beat to its story until far into it when they mention, oh hey, by the way, we need to get the gauntlet to Ant-Man's van. And finally, after 2.5 minutes of punching, the characters actually have a goal they need to achieve, which gives the fight at least some basic sense of a story.
It's the sway of the fight. It's to show that heroes are doing well before Thanos gets a hold of the gauntlet, before the tables slowly begin to turn with our heroes getting destroyed. Surely the goal was to take down Thanos and his army and the dozens of ships above. It's a pretty big goal if you ask me. It certainly wasn't 2 minutes of wasted time. If anything, I just wanted more.
There is that one moment where Captain Marvel destroys Thanos' ship, and that does create a grand feeling of progression as the dynamic of the fight shifts.
I love it how his biggest compliment is my main complaint. He goes on to state that the army behind Thanos has no sense of progression. I do actually agree with him on this to some extent. I think it would have been really nice if the people close to Thanos would get their own sort of moments in the fight as well. There's not really anything that downgrades the overall quality of the fight, it would have just been nice to get more. But I don't quite agree with his next statement.
And what is the setting of this battle for? A game of hot potato, where Thanos is chasing all the characters around the battlefield trying to get the gauntlet. This battle is not an epic one. It is a small-scale one between a handful of characters fighting over a MacGuffin.
The problem here is, again, he's really selling it short by just calling it a game of hot potato. The heroes are trying to get it away from Thanos because otherwise he'll wipe out all of living life. The stakes are higher here than Infinity War.
If you ask me, this film really would have benefited from the Russos spending more time learning about creative writing.
Ouch. So this was just an audiobook sponsorship, he just needed to transition it from creative writing. So we're now in the second half of his video, and it's more just, oh yeah, the Lord of the Rings, that's brilliant. But that's why Endgame's bad. The only real interesting point that he made in the second half, which I think is worth talking about, is the fact that the Endgame battle doesn't really have a good sense of geography to it, which I can agree with. There are a few establishing shots in there, but I think maybe a bird's eye view shot at some stage would have been really neat, just to sort of get an idea of the overall scale and which characters are where, because it's difficult to compare the absolute ruin to how it was before. So obviously credit where credit's due, I think he did offer some very good things that could make the battle potentially a bit better, and I think we'd all have our personal preferences as to more things we want in there, but I don't think this video did a very good job at explaining exactly why it's bad. But yeah, that's all I really have to say.